It's Thursday, the 14th of August. Welcome to the President's Daily Brief. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. All right, let's get briefed. First up, a new video from Gaza shows a number of armed terrorists posing as World Central Kitchen staff before being eliminated by Israeli forces, after the IDF confirmed with the WCK that the terrorists were not part of their organization. It's just yet another case of Hamas using civilians to shield its operations. We'll have those details. Later in the show, President Trump huddles with Ukraine's Zelensky and top European leaders ahead of his upcoming face-to-face with Vladimir Putin in a push to shape the outcome of the talks. Plus, the UN plans to add Hamas to its blacklist for conflict-related sexual violence committed during the 7 October attacks, and warns Israel, well, it could be next. And in today's Back of the Brief, a whistleblower makes an accusation against Senator Adam Schiff, claiming the lawmaker approved intelligence leaks to smear President Trump. I am 0% shocked that Schiff could be engaged in intel leaks or disinformation or outright lying. But first, today's PDB Spotlight. We'll begin today in Gaza, where the Israeli military has just released some of the clearest evidence yet that Hamas uses civilians and civilian institutions as human shields. On Tuesday, the IDF released video footage showing at least 10 terror operatives, some of them armed, posing as members of the World Central Kitchen humanitarian organization. The men can be seen in the video wearing bright vests as they huddle around a vehicle marked with the WCK's emblem on its roof. We should note that humanitarian vehicles operating in Gaza all display their affiliation on their roofs in order to make it clear to the Israeli military that they're not combatants. That's according to a report from the New York Post. But the IDF swiftly deduced that the men were militants using the logo of the WCK as cover, likely to smuggle weapons or humanitarian aid. The vehicle can later be seen driving off down a dirt road with several armed terrorists hanging off the side. Out of abundance of caution, members of the IDF military unit that oversees the distribution of aid contacted the World Central Kitchen about the group of men, confirming that they had no affiliation with the humanitarian organization. Officials with the IDF said they later conducted a targeted strike on the vehicle's position, killing 5 of the armed terrorists. In a statement, the IDF said, quote, "The terrorists deliberately attached the WCK emblem and wore yellow vests in an attempt to disguise their activities and avoid being targeted, cynically exploiting the status and trust given to aid organizations," end quote. Now, Israel regularly faces accusations, of course, that they flagrantly target aid workers. But this episode illustrates the realities on the ground and how those realities, well, often differ from the Hamas narratives. The fact that the militants were using aid vests and humanitarian logos as a form of protection, well, suggests that Hamas knows that Israel does not intentionally target humanitarian volunteers. Officials with the WCK condemned the actions of the terrorists, warning that it puts the lives of real aid workers and civilians, of course, operating across Gaza at risk. Meanwhile, Israel continues to defend itself against accusations of genocide in Gaza. International outrage has been growing, but much of the mainstream media reporting on the situation relies on health data from Hamas-controlled authorities in Gaza. And that's a fact that much of the media deems inconvenient and worthy of overlooking. On Tuesday, Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories, also known as COGAT, accused Hamas of significantly inflating the toll of Palestinians it says have died from malnutrition. Specifically, COGAT said an investigation of Hamas's starvation claims by Israeli medical experts reveals the majority of civilians that have allegedly died from malnutrition had pre-existing conditions. They contend that Hamas has engaged in, quote, an orchestrated campaign as part of a broader effort to discredit the state of Israel and achieve political gains, end quote. Ever since Hamas kicked off this conflict with their attacks on October 7th of 2023, up until June of 2025, the Hamas-run health ministry had reported 66 deaths from alleged starvation. That number surged in July to more than 133. But Israeli officials say despite the apparently high death toll in July, the health ministry did not release the identities of the deceased as it had done in the past. A subsequent in-depth review of the data revealed only a handful of real cases, suggesting that the data discrepancy was a deliberate attempt by Hamas to exploit the plight of Palestinian civilians, of course, to garner global sympathy and intensify international pressure on Israel to end the war. As I mentioned, Israeli investigators have also found that most of those allegedly dying from malnutrition had pre-existing medical conditions that led to the deterioration of their health, unrelated to their nutritional status. Kogat said this, quote, indicates that the documented cases do not represent the condition of the general population in the Gaza Strip, and that Hamas, quote, selectively present extreme cases involving pre-existing illnesses, end quote. But Israeli officials say the media is quick to take the bait, and that is true. They point to a recent New York Times article that used the photo of an emaciated child to illustrate the crisis, without disclosing the child suffered from a pre-existing genetic condition impacting brain and muscle development. The Times later had to issue a correction. Now, none of this means that the war isn't taking a devastating toll on the local population. Of course it is. But the situation on the ground is, well, much more nuanced than Hamas and media reports have implied. We'd also be remiss not to mention the fact that despite Israel greatly increasing the flow of supplies into the enclave in recent weeks, reports show Hamas is systematically stealing humanitarian aid while the broader Palestinian population continues to go hungry. As we recently covered, data from the United Nations Office for Project Services, this is UN-provided data, shows that roughly 9 out of every 10 aid convoys from the UN into the enclave are looted by civilian mobs or hijacked by Hamas terrorists. All right, coming up after the break, Trump huddles with Zelensky and European leaders before his Friday meeting with Putin, as the UN moves to blacklist Hamas for sexual violence perpetrated during their 7 October attacks, and warns Israel it could be next. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here. Now, you've heard me talk about the great company Jacked Up Fitness and their amazing all-in-one home gym. It is a complete game changer for home fitness. And now, I've got some more exciting news from Don and his excellent team at Jacked Up Fitness. Look, they know that many people are short on time and short on money, but still want to get fit. So, now you can start your fitness journey for under $60 and in just 6 minutes each day. Introducing the all-new Shake Weight by Jacked Up Fitness. 15 years ago, the original Shake Weight shook the world, right? You remember that, of course. Now the fitness legend returns. It's bigger, it's better, and built to perform. Why now, you ask? Well, that's a good question to ask. Because science has finally caught up with the importance of explosive power and fast-twitch muscle training, something the Shake Weight delivers in a compact, powerful way for beginners, for heavy lifters, and serious athletes alike. Look, the spring-loaded weights on each end send shockwaves of energy throughout your whole upper body, forcing your muscles to contract up to 240 times a minute. Beginners can tone and tighten their arms, their shoulders, and chest. Lifters can prime their upper bodies in between sets and get that final burn, while athletes can sharpen reaction times and build explosive power for that competitive edge. The Shake Weight is serious business. It's serious training made simple. So if you're looking for a fun way to jumpstart or supercharge your fitness routine, get the all-new Shake Weight by Jacked Up Fitness. Just go to jackedupshakeweight.com. Again, that's jackedupshakeweight.com. Welcome back to the PDB. As global attention zeroes in on tomorrow's face-to-face between President Trump and Russian President Putin, Trump used a Wednesday virtual call with Ukrainian President Zelensky and top European leaders to lay out a potential roadmap to secure a ceasefire. The more than hour-long conversation was billed in Kyiv and across Europe as perhaps the last shot at shaping Trump's approach before he sits down with Putin. The aim the president outlined matched Ukraine and Europe's talking points, but that's against the ongoing reality of Putin flatly rejecting any unconditional halt to the fighting. As we discussed earlier this week, the Kremlin has been on a military offensive now in eastern Ukraine, angling for fresh leverage perhaps at the negotiating table, or just angling for more land. Two sources familiar with the discussions said Trump downplayed expectations, calling the first encounter a, quote, feel-out. I'd frankly come up with a different term, but told French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz that a ceasefire remains his immediate target. Macron, described by one source as taking, quote, very tough positions, warned that even agreeing to meet was, quote, a very big thing to give to Putin. Now, that's a remark that reportedly did not sit well with Trump, who's been pushing to end the war since his return to office. Zelensky, in turn, repeated his mantra in the meeting that, quote, Putin cannot be trusted, and that he had, quote, no right to surrender Ukrainian land as part of any potential ceasefire. Trump, meanwhile, said territorial questions were, quote, for Putin and Zelensky to decide, while conceding that land swaps would likely be a part of any deal. Merz later claimed Trump, quote, largely agreed that Russia shouldn't receive legal recognition for occupied territory. Other leaders on the call, including NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, pressed their own priorities. Rutte was described by the sources as, quote, very active in the exchange. Meloni offered several points, though details were withheld. Starmer underscored the need for credible security guarantees for Ukraine, while von der Leyen called the virtual session overall, quote, very good. According to the sources, Trump said he was taking the process, quote, one day at a time. His advisors insist the administration are being optimistic, telling the sources, quote, but we're not crazy, this is hard. Oh, well, that's good to know. One advisor added that the Kremlin's ceasefire foot-dragging is exhausting, and that, quote, this is where the art of the deal becomes possible, end quote. Who are these advisors? After Wednesday's call, Zelensky, appearing alongside Merz in Berlin, pitched a trilateral summit with himself, Trump, and Putin. Now, Trump is reportedly on board with that plan. Putin, although, is not, still refusing to recognize Zelensky as a legitimate president of Ukraine after his term expired under martial law. Still, Trump said that if Friday's meeting goes well, he wants a near immediate follow-up, but with Zelensky present. The president also warned of, quote, very severe consequences if Putin refuses to end the war, without specifying whether that meant new sanctions or tariffs. Zelensky told reporters that Putin's long-standing claim that sanctions won't hurt is all bluff, a view echoed by European capitals. Last Friday's deadline for Trump's threatened new Russia sanctions came and went without any action. But one EU source said secondary sanctions do remain on the table, especially after the White House's recent 25% tariff that was slapped on India for buying Russian oil. No such tariff was slapped on China, and China is the largest consumer of Russian oil and gas. Whether Friday's face-to-face yields even the outline of a ceasefire will be clear soon enough. For now, allies are left to guess how far Trump is willing to push and how much Putin is truly prepared to give. Well, while I don't know how far Trump is willing to push, I would venture to guess that Putin is truly prepared to give nothing. Okay, shifting back to the war in Gaza. After nearly 21 months of largely ignoring the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israeli citizens during their brutal 7 October attacks, the UN will finally put the terror group on their blacklist of state and non-state parties guilty of sexual violence. Oh, well done, UN. It only took almost 2 years to make that obvious decision. I wonder, was it all the video taken by Hamas showing their own barbaric actions that confused the UN? If only they had had more clues. According to a report from the Jerusalem Post, a draft report written by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was distributed to members of the UN Security Council on Tuesday ahead of a special discussion on sexual violence related to the war, scheduled for the 19th of August in New York. The annual report tracks organizations and countries that have committed sexual violence as a weapon of war and says Hamas engaged in a deliberate pattern of abuse during the 7 October massacres, as well as against hostages being held inside Gaza. It's a notable shift for the UN, which declined to include the terror group on the blacklist in 2024, claiming there was insufficient evidence directly linking the group to reported sexual assaults. At the time, Israeli officials were understandably incensed by the glaring omission, calling it blatant anti-Semitism. Israeli officials noted that a UN report issued in March of 2024 had already detailed the extreme acts of depravity carried out by Hamas terrorists during the attack. That 24-page report was compiled by a team from the UN's Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict and found numerous instances of sexual violence perpetrated against Israeli citizens on October 7th, as well as evidence of ongoing abuse against the hostages being held by Hamas. But Guterres defended last year's decision, arguing the blacklist was based only on, quote, UN-verified information. Oh. He claimed a more comprehensive investigation was, well, needed to determine if Hamas belonged on the blacklist. Yes, what shall we do? I do get tired of putting the UN and the word feckless in the same sentence. A turning point came last month with the release of the Project Dinah report by researchers at Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv. The report documented evidence of rape, sexual assault, and deliberate mutilation of Israeli victims by Hamas. The report described the abuse as a systematic, deliberate, and premeditated weapon of war used by the Hamas militants. The extensive report was based on the testimony of a survivor of an attempted rape at the Nova Music Festival, interviews with 17 eyewitnesses, conversations with therapists who treated victims, and the published testimonies of 15 hostages who were released from captivity in Gaza. Researchers found that sexual violence occurred at no fewer than 6 locations during the 7 October attacks and continued to be perpetrated against hostages while in captivity, showing a clear pattern of intentionality on the part of Hamas, meeting the UN's rather high threshold for inclusion on the blacklist, at least a high threshold for Hamas. That report was sent directly to the Office of the UN Secretary General and helped corroborate findings of an independent commission of inquiry put out by the Secretary General in September of 2024. Regarding the UN's decision to finally acknowledge the horrific sexual violence committed by Hamas terrorists, an unnamed Israeli government source told the publication Ynet, quote, "Not only is this good news that the UN is finally adding Hamas to the blacklist, but it also shows that when serious, thorough work is done, the UN cannot ignore it," end quote. But it appears the UN continues to hold Israel to a different standard. The UN draft report warned Israel that they could soon find themselves on the same blacklist alongside Hamas. In a letter to Israel's UN ambassador, Danny Danon, Guterres officially put Jerusalem, quote, on notice, saying he had grave concerns over allegations of sexual violence committed by Israeli security forces against Palestinians in multiple prisons, a detention facility, and a military base. Guterres outlined steps the Israeli government must take to avoid being blacklisted in next year's report, including issuing directives against sexual violence, creating enforcement and disciplinary systems, investigating every credible complaint, and granting the UN free access to Israeli facilities for monitoring and humanitarian aid. Israel's UN ambassador rejected the allegations as, quote, unfounded, absurd, and based on biased publications, and called on Guterres to remove Israel from any consideration for listing. Danon suggested the UN was attempting to create a gross moral equivalence between Hamas's barbarity and isolated cases in Israel that have since been prosecuted by the military. He called on the UN to keep their focus on, quote, the horrific war crimes perpetrated by Hamas and on the immediate release of all the hostages, end quote. All right, coming up next in the back of the brief, a whistleblower claims that Adam Schiff authorized classified leaks to smear Donald Trump and expected to be tapped as CIA director if Hillary Clinton won. Say it ain't so. No offense, but the king of disinformation from the Russia hoax couldn't organize panic in a doomed submarine. And he imagined he would have the integrity, the character, and the ability to lead the world's preeminent intelligence service. Well, more on that story when we come back. Hey, Mike Baker here. Let me take just a moment of your time to talk about protecting your hard-earned assets. Now, you've probably noticed out there in the world there's a little bit of turmoil in the economy, right? You got trade wars. Well, you got tariffs back and forth. You got a U.S. Federal Reserve that seems a bit at odds with the White House. There's uncertainty over employment numbers. There's a volatile stock market. You get the picture, right? It's at times like these that it's important to think about your assets and how to protect them from volatility. Now, one way to do that is through diversification. And I'm here to suggest that you consider diversifying with gold from the Birch Gold Group. They're the precious metals specialists. Look, for decades, gold has been considered a safe haven during times of economic stagnation or global uncertainty. And Birch Gold makes it incredibly easy for you to diversify some of your savings into gold. If you have an IRA or maybe an old 401k, you can convert that into a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold. Or like a lot of people, you can just buy gold and store it safely at home. First, you want to get yourself educated. Birch Gold can send you a free information kit on gold. Just text PDB to the number 989-898. Again, text PDB to 989-898. Consider diversifying a portion of your savings into gold. Text PDB to 989-898. In today's back of the brief, bombshell whistleblower allegations say that in 2016, Senator Adam Schiff, then the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, approved leaks of classified material to damage Donald Trump and was convinced that he'd be rewarded with the CIA's top job if Hillary Clinton had won. The whistleblower, a veteran Democratic committee staffer, says this was part of a calculated effort to topple the Trump campaign and his then administration. It's the latest layer in our earlier coverage on former CIA Director John Brennan, ex-FBI Director James Comey, and the Justice Department's Strike Force investigation into intelligence abuses. According to the whistleblower, described as friends with both Schiff and then committee chairman Devin Nunes, Schiff was, quote, particularly upset after Trump's 2016 victory. Well, yeah, it did, as I recall, take him several weeks to unask the fainting couch. In FBI interviews in September and December 2017, the whistleblower claimed Democratic leaders on the panel believed Russia had, quote, hijacked the election, and that leaking classified material was the way to, quote, fix the constitutional crisis. Let me put it another way. Democratic leaders were so incensed about Trump's victory that they convinced themselves that the world was ending, and the only way to save it was to break the law. Look, this has been the case all along. Frankly, if you paint your adversary as Hitler, you can justify any of your own actions and feel righteous at the same time. The staffer said he first heard in October 2016 that Schiff was being considered for a senior intelligence post in the Clinton administration, an opportunity, of course, that evaporated after her loss. And in a June 2023 FBI interview, the whistleblower alleged Schiff later convened an all-staff meeting where he laid out a plan to leak derogatory information about Trump to secure an indictment. The whistleblower says he objected to the plan, calling it, quote, unethical and treasonous, but was told by others that, quote, they would not be caught. From there, he alleges, a system was put in place. Sensitive intelligence flowed to Schiff, who decided what to pass along to the press. Democratic Representative Eric Swalwell was allegedly a frequent participant, with colleagues saying he had, quote, a reputation for leaking. In one instance, a document seen only by Schiff and Swalwell, well, and perhaps Swalwell's former Chinese Ministry of State security friend with benefits, Fang Fang, appeared in the media almost verbatim within a day. The whistleblower says he was later invited to take part in a mock grand jury session as part of a potential case into Schiff's alleged leaks, but was ultimately told the Justice Department would not investigate further, citing the Constitution's speech or debate clause. He argued that that protection didn't apply to Schiff. Soon after, he was fired for what he called a, quote, perceived lack of party loyalty for refusing to take part in the leaks. The allegations were first reported by Just the News and confirmed on X by FBI Director Kash Patel, who posted, quote, now Congress can see how classified info was leaked to shape political narratives and decide if our institutions were weaponized against the American people, end quote. Now, whether these latest claims trigger legal action or, well, because it's Washington, D.C., nothing happens, they do mark yet another chapter in a saga that shows no signs of ending anytime soon. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Thursday, the 14th of August. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. Of course, to listen to the show ad-free, well, just become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. Couldn't be simpler. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.